Chapter 1. The Landscape of Complex PTSD. The journey of recovering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a profound and often arduous expedition, one that requires immense courage and a willingness to confront the ghosts of a fractured past. For many who carry this burden, the suffering has been silent, invisible, and deeply confusing. It is a specific kind of agony that arises not necessarily from a single catastrophic event like a natural disaster or a war zone, but from an accumulation of ongoing, repetitive childhood trauma. This condition takes root in the very environment that is supposed to serve as a sanctuary. When the home becomes a place of danger, emotional starvation, or persistent neglect, the developing child is left without a secure base. The resulting trauma is woven into the fabric of the nervous system, leaving the individual to navigate adulthood with the emotional reflexes of a terrified child. The cornerstone of this condition, and arguably its most agonizing feature, is the emotional flashback. Unlike the flashbacks typical of standard PTSD, which often involve visual or auditory hallucinations of a specific traumatic incident, emotional flashbacks are sudden and prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of childhood. When triggered, you are not literally seeing a past event play out before your eyes. Instead, you are violently plunged back into the raw, unmitigated despair, terror, or helplessness that you experienced as a vulnerable child. A minor disagreement, a perceived slight, or even a particular tone of voice can act as a trapdoor, dropping you instantly into an emotional abyss. In these moments, the rational adult mind is hijacked. The world feels profoundly unsafe, and your emotional reactions become entirely disproportionate to the present situation because you are, emotionally speaking, responding to the past. Coating the surface of almost every emotional flashback is the heavy, suffocating sludge of toxic shame. This is not the healthy remorse that guides moral behavior when we make a mistake. Toxic shame is a pervasive, marrow-deep conviction that you are fundamentally flawed, unlovable, and completely defective. It is the agonizing veneer that makes emotional flashbacks so unbearable. When children are abused or neglected, they lack the cognitive development to understand that their parents are failing them. Survival depends entirely on the caregivers. Therefore, it is far too terrifying for a child to believe that their parents are dangerous or incompetent. Instead, the child's mind makes a tragic, life-saving calculation. They conclude that the abuse or neglect is their own fault. They internalize the belief that they are inherently bad, thereby preserving the illusion that the parents are good and that safety might be earned if only the child could become perfect. This internalized self-hatred solidifies into a venomous inner critic that will ruthlessly police the individual for decades to come. As this condition develops, it brings with it a constellation of profoundly distressing symptoms. Those suffering often endure a pervasive sense of loneliness, even when surrounded by others, feeling as though they are fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. There is a persistent social anxiety, a hypervigilance that scans every room and every face for potential threat. Many experience a terrifying fragility of self-esteem, where a single mistake feels like absolute proof of worthlessness. In the darkest moments of these emotional regressions, suicidal ideation frequently emerges. However, it is crucial to understand that in the context of complex PTSD, this ideation is rarely an active desire to end one's life. Rather, it is a passive, desperate yearning to escape the agonizing pain of the flashback. It is the exhausted cry of an inner child who simply cannot bear the weight of their own existence any longer. Tragically, because the landscape of complex PTSD is still not universally understood within the broader psychiatric community, countless individuals are handed devastating misdiagnoses. The severe mood swings triggered by emotional flashbacks are often mislabeled as bipolar disorder. The profound flattening of affect and loss of vitality are mistaken for major clinical depression. The dissociative spacing out is misidentified as attention deficit disorder. Most damaging of all, the frantic attempts to soothe the terror of abandonment are frequently misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder. While medications and treatments for these standard diagnoses might offer some surface-level symptom management, they almost completely fail to address the root cause, which is a fundamental injury to the individual's attachment system and a nervous system stuck in a state of perpetual emergency. To truly understand the origins of this condition, we must look deeply at the nature of trauma itself. Trauma is not merely what happens to you, it is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. It is the loss of connection to oneself and the present moment. While active physical or verbal abuse leaves obvious scars, it is often the invisible wound of emotional neglect that forms the core of complex PTSD. Emotional neglect is the absence of what should have been there, The lack of a comforting touch, the absence of an empathetic gaze, the deafening silence when a child cries out for reassurance. A child needs more than just food and shelter to thrive. They require active emotional engagement to develop a cohesive sense of self. Without it, the child experiences a soul-crushing abandonment that stultifies their relational intelligence and arrests their development. When faced with this ongoing threat to survival, the human nervous system instinctively relies on 4 primitive defensive strategies. These are universally recognized as the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. In a healthy, non-traumatized individual, these are situational and temporary reactions to immediate danger. You fight off an attacker, you flee from a burning building, you freeze to avoid detection by a predator, or you fawn, appeasing to de-escalate a confrontation. However, when a child is trapped in a traumatizing family environment, these temporary defenses become permanent personality structures. The fight response develops in the child who learns that safety can only be secured through dominance and control. They armor themselves with a narcissistic defense, unconsciously believing that if they are intimidating and flawless, no one can ever hurt them again. The flight response takes root in the child who tries to outrun the pain. This manifests as the obsessive-compulsive defense. They become human doings rather than human beings, frantically staying busy, overachieving, and pursuing unattainable perfection to ensure the inner critic has no space to attack. The freeze response is the tragedy of the child who realizes that fighting back is impossible and running away is futile. They survive by shutting down, retreating into the profound isolation of a dissociative defense. They disconnect from their bodies and their emotions, taking refuge in excessive daydreaming, screens, or isolation, effectively playing dead to the world. Finally, the fawn response develops in the child whose only path to survival is the complete forfeiture of their own needs. This is the codependent defense. They learn to meticulously scan the emotional weather of their parents, merging with their desires and becoming highly attuned people-pleasers, hoping that absolute subservience will buy them a scrap of safety or prevent the next explosion. Within a severely traumatizing family system, these differing survival responses often turn siblings against one another. Poor parenting creates a breeding ground for pathological sibling rivalry. When parents fail to model fairness, empathy, or healthy conflict resolution, siblings are left to compete viciously for the scarce resources of parental approval and safety. One child might adopt a fawn response and become the parentified helper, while another might adopt a fight response and become the scapegoat or the bully. Instead of finding solace and solidarity in each other, the children are pitted in a desperate gladiatorial combat for survival. This deprives them of the one relationship that might have offered a shared reality, leaving them to carry the heavy mantle of their trauma entirely alone as they move forward into an unwritten future. Chapter 2: The Multi-Dimensional Path to Recovery. Healing from the profound injuries of a traumatizing childhood is neither a linear progression nor a singular task. Because prolonged early trauma arrests development across the entire spectrum of human experience, true recovery demands a deeply holistic and multidimensional approach. When a developing child is repeatedly subjected to abuse, neglect, or emotional abandonment, the clock of their psychological growth is violently stopped. Vital developmental milestones are missed, leaving the adult survivor to navigate a complex world equipped only with the fractured tools of an injured child. To reclaim the self that was forced into hiding, we must systematically address the damage left behind on 4 distinct but deeply interconnected levels: the cognitive, the emotional, the spiritual, and the somatic. The journey almost always must begin in the realm of cognitive healing. For the survivor, the mind is rarely a sanctuary. It is a hostile territory, dominated by a vicious internal monologue. This cognitive dimension of recovery involves a fundamental re-education of the intellect. It requires the survivor to understand how their developing brain was shaped by the constant presence of danger. Central to this phase is the arduous, ongoing task of shrinking the harsh inner critic. Through dedicated psychoeducation, we learn that our profound distress, our relentless perfectionism, and our pervasive sense of endangerment are not evidence of innate defectiveness. Rather, they are highly adapted, learned reactions to an unbearable past. This intellectual framework is the vital bedrock upon which all other healing is built. It provides the crucial context that allows us to step back and observe the damage without immediately identifying with it. This newfound cognitive awareness naturally paves the way for the practice of mindfulness. In the context of trauma recovery, mindfulness is not a passive state of relaxation, but an active, vigilant process of observing our thoughts without being consumed or hijacked by them. It is the cultivation of a developmentally arrested healthy ego, a protective, rational inner presence that can stand firmly between the vulnerable inner child and the relentless assaults of the inner critic. By learning to recognize the critic's voice and consciously halting its toxic narratives, we begin to carve out a mental clearing. We slowly replace the internalized hatred of our abusers with a firm, protective, and ultimately compassionate internal dialogue. As the mind becomes a slightly safer environment, the survivor must courageously venture into the shattered emotional landscape. Complex trauma involves a devastating loss of one's emotional nature. In a toxic family system, the authentic expression of feelings, especially anger or sadness, is often punished or dangerously ignored. Consequently, the child learns to amputate their own emotions to survive. What replaces this natural emotional vitality is the heavy, suffocating sludge of toxic shame. This shame is so destructive, so absolute in its erasure of a child's innate worth, that it can be likened to a form of soul murder. Recovering true emotional intelligence requires a deep, sustained, and often agonizing engagement with the process of grieving. Grieving in this context is far more than merely shedding tears over what was lost. It is the active, deliberate process of finally feeling the profound sorrow, the righteous anger, and the paralyzing fear that were strictly prohibited in childhood. Through verbal ventilation, the act of speaking our pain, our memories, and our outrage aloud to a safe, compassionate witness, we slowly dismantle the heavy walls of toxic shame. By bringing the darkness into the light of shared human connection, we validate our own suffering and systematically reclaim our fundamental right to feel. Beyond the mind and the emotions lies the necessity of spiritual healing. This is not necessarily tethered to any organized religion or dogma. Rather, it is about restoring a shattered sense of belonging and meaning in the universe. Severe trauma profoundly isolates the individual, leaving them feeling like an alien wanderer in a hostile world. Spiritual healing involves the deliberate cultivation of gratitude, not as a toxic positivity that ignores pain, but as a grounded appreciation for the present moment and the small, safe realities of the current world. It is the slow, deliberate practice of internalizing the good enough parenting we so desperately needed but never received. By developing profound self-compassion, we gradually replace the punishing, indifferent deity of our childhood environment with an inner sanctuary of unconditional love and quiet acceptance. Finally, we must recognize that trauma is not merely an invisible psychological phenomenon stored in the mind. It is a visceral reality locked within the muscles, the nervous system, and the very tissues of the body. Somatic healing is the recognition that the body keeps an uncompromising score of the past. For decades, the survivor may have unconsciously carried their body as a suit of heavy armor, locked in a perpetual state of bracing against anticipated physical or emotional blows. We must learn to safely inhabit our physical forms again. This somatic return requires immense patience. It involves learning self-help techniques to release deep-seated physical tension and grounding ourselves when we feel the terrifying unmooring of dissociation. It also demands a fiercely honest yet compassionate examination of how we use substances or behaviors to numb our physical and emotional discomfort. We must address the complexities of self-medication and our often fraught relationships with food, recognizing these not as moral failings, but as desperate physiological attempts to soothe an agonizing internal reality. In some instances, the judicious use of prescribed medication can provide the vital scaffolding needed to calm a severely dysregulated nervous system. By quieting the persistent biological alarms, we create the necessary physiological space for the deeper, multidimensional work of recovery to fully unfold. Chapter 3. The Search for Belonging. Healing Relationships. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is, at its deepest core, an attachment disorder. It is a profound injury to the human need for connection, forged in the crucible of early relationships that were supposed to be safe but were instead fraught with danger or hollowed out by neglect. Because the fundamental wounding occurred within the context of a relationship, the ultimate healing must also be relational. This presents the survivor with a devastating paradox. The very mechanism required for salvation, intimacy, and human connection is precisely what the traumatized nervous system perceives as the greatest threat to survival. From this paradox emerges the crushing weight of social anxiety. In the context of a traumatizing childhood, the child learns that to be seen is to be a target. Visibility equates to vulnerability, and vulnerability invites abuse, criticism, or abandonment. As a result, the survivor moves through the adult world wearing a heavy cloak of hypervigilance, constantly scanning interpersonal interactions for the inevitable moment of betrayal. Social anxiety is not merely a fear of awkwardness, it is a primal terror of emotional annihilation. It is the expectation that the world will ultimately mirror the hostility and indifference of the original family system. Healing the deep-seated shame that binds the survivor in this profound loneliness requires immense courage, as it demands stepping back into the very arena where the original soul murder took place. The journey of relational healing begins with the search for safe, good enough connections. This does not mean seeking a perfect savior, a flawless romantic partner, or an omniscient therapist. The concept of good enough is rooted in the reality that human beings are fallible. What the survivor desperately needs is a relationship characterized by consistent empathy, authentic vulnerability, and a commitment to collaborative repair when ruptures inevitably occur. Whether this connection is found in a trained therapist, a compassionate partner, or a dedicated support group, it serves as a secure base. It is a testing ground where the survivor can slowly begin to unlearn the toxic relational dynamics of their childhood and discover that conflict does not have to mean abandonment, and that expressing a need does not have to result in punishment. A crucial phase in this relational recovery is what can be described as a psychological parent-dectomy. This is the arduous, necessary process of emotionally evicting the internalized abusers from the psyche. For decades, the survivor has carried the voices, the contempt, and the neglectful indifference of their parents within their own mind, allowing these phantoms to dictate their self-worth. A parent-dectomy involves recognizing that continuing to seek the approval of fundamentally damaged or toxic caregivers is a futile and self-destructive endeavor. It requires severing the emotional umbilical cord that keeps the survivor tied to the hope of a magical reconciliation, choosing instead to redirect that immense energy toward the cultivation of a new, internal family system. This redirection leads directly to the profound work of reparenting the self. Because the survivor was denied the essential nutrients of healthy parenting, they must now learn to provide these crucial elements to their own inner child. Reparenting is divided into two vital complementary functions: self-mothering and self-fathering. Self-mothering is the active cultivation of an internal presence of boundless compassion. It is the gentle, unconditional acceptance of the inner child's pain, fear, and sorrow. When an emotional flashback strikes, the internal mother does not criticize or demand immediate composure. Instead, she offers a sanctuary of soothing reassurance. She is the voice that whispers that it is okay to cry, that the pain is valid, and that the child is fundamentally lovable exactly as they are. Equally vital is the practice of self-fathering. If self-mothering provides the sanctuary, self-fathering provides the fortress. The internal father is the fierce protector, the champion who stands between the vulnerable inner child and the hostility of the outside world, as well as the vicious attacks of the inner critic. Self-fathering involves setting rigid, uncompromising boundaries against abuse. It is the cultivation of a strong, assertive energy that declares that mistreatment will no longer be tolerated. A powerful technique within self-fathering is the time machine rescue operation. In this deeply healing visualization, the adult survivor mentally travels back to specific scenes of childhood trauma. Stepping into the memory, the adult self fiercely intervenes, stopping the abuse, standing up to the perpetrators, and physically carrying the terrified child away to a place of permanent safety. As the survivor engages in this intense inner child work, it is necessary to confront the mature realities of love. A common trap for those recovering from severe attachment trauma is the desperate search for unconditional love from others in adulthood. While we must learn to give unconditional love to our own inner child, demanding it from adult relationships is a recipe for further heartbreak. Healthy adult relationships are inherently conditional. They require mutual respect, reciprocity, and the maintenance of boundaries. By accepting the limits of unconditional love in the external world, the survivor protects themselves from repeating the cycle of codependent merging and inevitable disappointment. No single person can provide the full spectrum of developmental needs that were missed in childhood. Therefore, the survivor must learn to build a reparenting committee. This committee is a diverse, carefully selected constellation of influences that provide different facets of guidance, comfort, and inspiration. It may include trusted friends, empathetic therapists, supportive partners, and even the authors of profoundly resonant books. By drawing wisdom and comfort from a wide variety of safe sources, the survivor avoids the dangerous trap of making one person the sole arbiter of their emotional survival. Through this multifaceted approach, the survivor slowly learns the true art of relating, moving from the terror of isolated survival into the warm, complex, and deeply rewarding experience of shared human belonging. Chapter 4: The Core Wound, Understanding Childhood, Abandonment. Among the most persistent obstacles in the journey of recovery is the insidious voice of denial, frequently echoing in the form of a single haunting question: what if I was never hit? For many survivors of complex PTSD, the absence of physical bruises or shattered bones serves as a twisted justification to minimize their own suffering. Society at large often reinforces this minimization, readily validating the trauma of overt physical and sexual abuse while remaining perilously blind to the devastation wrought by verbal and emotional violence. Yet the human psyche does not readily distinguish between a hand raised in anger and a voice saturated with contempt. Verbal and emotional abuse are not merely lesser traumas, they are direct assaults on the developing soul, leaving invisible psychological lacerations that can dictate the course of a lifetime. Beneath even the sting of verbal abuse lies an even more silent and insidious injury: emotional neglect. Emotional neglect is the core wound in complex PTSD. It is the agonizing absence of what should have been there: the warmth, the attuned gaze, the comforting touch, and the steady reassurance that a child intrinsically matters. When a child is chronically ignored, dismissed, or treated as a burden, they experience a profound failure to thrive. In severe cases, infants denied physical and emotional affection can literally die, a phenomenon well documented in early orphanage studies. For those who survive physical maturation in an emotionally barren environment, the failure to thrive syndrome moves inward. The child survives biologically, but emotionally starves, growing into an adult who feels fundamentally hollow, disconnected, and deeply unworthy of occupying space in the world. This emotional starvation gives rise to an agonizing and perpetual emotional hunger. Because human beings are biologically wired for attachment, the absence of early parental connection is interpreted by the infant brain not merely as sadness, but as an existential threat. The evolutionary basis of attachment dictates that a child without a caregiver will perish. Therefore, emotional abandonment triggers a primal terror. To cope with this unbearable void, the survivor often turns to addiction. Whether it is substance abuse, compulsive overeating, workaholism, or an endless series of chaotic relationships, these addictions are essentially desperate, misguided attempts to self-medicate the excruciating pain of early emotional starvation. They are frantic efforts to fill a bottomless well that was supposed to be filled by parental love. Furthermore, this chronic state of unmitigated abandonment severely stultifies emotional and relational intelligence. When all of a child's energetic resources are consumed by simply trying to survive the terror of neglect, there is nothing left for the development of higher-level emotional skills. The brain is quite literally rewired. The theoretical neurobiology of the inner critic suggests that the constant presence of danger or indifference hypertrophies the amygdala, the brain's fear center, while underdeveloping the prefrontal cortex where rational thought and self-soothing reside. The child internalizes the neglect, adopting the environment's indifference as their own inner voice. This internalized abuser becomes the inner critic, constantly whispering that the child's needs are foolish, their feelings are invalid, and their very existence is an imposition. To begin healing this profound injury, the survivor must engage in the radical act of deminimizing their emotional abandonment. This requires looking unflinchingly at the past and calling the neglect exactly what it was: a betrayal of the highest order. It is the terrifying process of peeling away the protective layers of denial and admitting the full extent of the emotional starvation endured. Central to this process is the power of narrative. By finally telling the truth about their childhood, whether in therapy, in a support group, or even in a private journal, the survivor externalizes the pain. They drag the dark, secret shame of their unlovability into the light of conscious awareness, where it can finally be examined and dismantled. Telling the authentic story breaks the hypnotic spell of the inner critic and lays the groundwork for reclaiming the self. As the truth of the past is acknowledged, the survivor must learn the delicate art of practicing vulnerability. Having spent a lifetime armored against further emotional injury, lowering those defenses feels counterintuitive and highly dangerous. Yet, true connection cannot occur behind a fortress wall. Practicing vulnerability means learning to safely express authentic feelings and needs in the present, taking small, calculated risks with trusted individuals to discover that the present world does not have to be a repetition of the traumatizing past. This courageous confrontation with the past inevitably brings us to the threshold of forgiveness. However, the concept of forgiveness is heavily loaded and frequently misunderstood in the realm of complex trauma. Society often pushes a premature, morally coercive narrative that survivors must forgive their abusers in order to heal. This external pressure to turn the other cheek can be profoundly re-traumatizing, serving only to silence the survivor's legitimate anger and reinforce their core shame. True, authentic forgiveness is not a prerequisite for recovery. Rather, it is a possible byproduct of deep, completed healing. Therefore, any sincere exploration of forgiveness must begin strictly and exclusively with the self. The survivor must direct the fierce light of compassion inward, forgiving themselves for the ways they survived. You must forgive yourself for the times you lashed out in a fight response, for the years lost to the obsessive-compulsive flight response, for the dissociation and isolation of the freeze response, and for the agonizing self-betrayal of the codependent fawn response. You must forgive yourself for your addictions, your emotional flashbacks, and your relational stumbles. You must recognize that every behavior you currently judge as a character flaw was, at its inception, a desperate, brilliant, and entirely necessary strategy to survive an unsurvivable environment. Self-forgiveness is the ultimate act of defiance against the abusers and the inner critic. It is the quiet, unbreakable vow that you will no longer carry the shame that rightfully belongs to those who failed you. Chapter 5. The 4 Styles of Survival. Finding your trauma type. To fully comprehend the architecture of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, we must understand the brilliant, albeit tragic, mechanics of the human nervous system. We are biologically endowed with 4 primary instinctive responses to danger. In a healthy, well-nurtured individual, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are fluid, accessible, and vital mechanisms for navigating a complex world. We utilize a healthy fight response to assert necessary boundaries, to protect our loved ones, and to demand fairness. We engage a healthy flight response when we recognize that a situation is irrevocably toxic or physically dangerous, allowing us to gracefully disengage and walk away. The healthy freeze response allows us to pause, to acutely assess a precarious situation before acting, or to surrender into deep, restorative rest. Finally, the healthy fawn response is the bedrock of social harmony. It is our capacity to compromise, to listen empathetically, and to nurture those around us. In a state of psychological health, these are temporary gears we shift into and out of as circumstances require. However, under the crushing weight of chronic childhood trauma, this fluid system crystallizes into a rigid prison. When a developing child is subjected to unremitting danger, emotional neglect, or capricious abuse, the nervous system becomes locked in the specific survival strategy that offers the highest probability of minimizing the pain. What was meant to be a fleeting biological defense hardens into a fixed personality trait. This results in the polarized trauma types. The survivor loses the ability to respond to the present moment and instead reacts to everything through the singular, distorted lens of their dominant childhood defense, forever bracing against an abandonment that has already happened. When a child learns that vulnerability is an invitation for further abuse, they may unconsciously decide that dominance is their only shield. This gives rise to the polarized fight response, heavily armored in a narcissistic defense. The fight type attempts to secure safety through power, intimidation, and an underlying attitude of contempt. Driven by a terrifying, unacknowledged core belief that they are utterly unlovable, they demand absolute perfection from their environment and the people within it. They utilize rage, criticism, and disgust to keep others at a safe, controllable distance. It is a profoundly tragic paradox. Their frantic, aggressive efforts to prevent the excruciating pain of rejection cause them to relentlessly alienate the very connections they secretly and desperately crave. For the fight type, the devastating inner critic is externalized, weaponized against the world to drown out the agonizing silence of their own inner abandonment. Another child, facing the same insurmountable danger, might calculate that moving faster than the pain is the only viable method of survival. This is the flight type, deeply entrenched in an obsessive-compulsive defense. These individuals exist in a perpetual state of left brain dissociation, effectively severing their connection to their emotional core by remaining endlessly occupied. For the polarized flight type, silence and stillness are not peaceful. They are terrifying, for it is in the quiet moments that the massive, underlying abandonment depression threatens to breach the surface. They chase an unattainable, flawless ideal, holding on to the magical belief that if they just achieve enough, produce enough, or look entirely flawless, the inner critic will finally grant them a moment of peace. Their lives are characterized by a frantic, exhausting momentum of doing that completely eclipses the simple, vital, and deeply feared act of being. When fighting back is utterly futile and escape is physically impossible, the nervous system deploys its most primal and desperate defense, shutting down completely. The polarized freeze type survives the unsurvivable by essentially playing dead. They retreat into a profound state of right brain dissociation, seeking ultimate safety in invisibility. Their internal world frequently becomes a landscape of elaborate fantasy, a quiet sanctuary far removed from the agonizing reality of their physical environment. In adulthood, this defense manifests as chronic isolation, a reflexive tendency to hide under stress, and a heavy, lethargic fog that numbs both joy and sorrow alike. The freeze type expertly camouflages themselves against the backdrop of life, preferring the quiet, aching despair of absolute loneliness to the terrifying unpredictability and potential betrayal of human connection. Perhaps the most deeply self-abandoning of all the survival strategies is the polarized fawn response. A child who recognizes that their caregivers are volatile, dangerous, or profoundly needy may discover that their only path to physical or emotional safety is the complete surrender of their own identity. They become highly attuned to the emotional weather of others, preemptively sacrificing their own desires, boundaries, and opinions to appease the potential threat. This is the bedrock of trauma-based codependency. The fawn type attempts to purchase safety through absolute compliance, offering themselves as a human shock absorber for the dysfunction of their environment. In doing so, they entirely forfeit their own sense of self, living merely as an empathetic mirror that exclusively reflects the demands, expectations, and moods of those around them. Human adaptation, however, is rarely entirely uniform, and many survivors develop complex trauma hybrids, shifting desperately between strategies as circumstances demand. The fight-fawn hybrid, for instance, may present as a demanding, smothering caretaker who aggressively controls others under the guise of excessive helping and unyielding advice. The flight-freeze hybrid is often the exhausted, hollowed-out overachiever, oscillating wildly between periods of frantic, obsessive productivity and sudden catastrophic collapses into deep dissociation and total burnout. The fight-freeze hybrid might exhibit the turbulent, agonizing push-and-pull dynamics often associated with severe relational instability, lashing out in a desperate attempt to secure connection before abruptly retreating behind an impenetrable wall of cold, stony detachment. The ultimate goal of identifying your specific trauma type is not to brand yourself with a permanent pathology, but to finally map the exact contours of your internal prison. True recovery is the slow, deliberate, and deeply courageous process of moving away from the extreme, polarized ends of these survival responses and returning to a flexible, healthy continuum. It involves the fight type, slowly risking the terrifying vulnerability of authentic, undefended connection. It requires the flight type to brave the stillness, discovering that they will not be destroyed by their own grief. It invites the freeze type to boldly re-enter the physical body and participate in the shared human world, and it demands that the fawn type painstakingly reclaim their fundamental, undeniable right to say no. By identifying the heavy armor we have worn for a lifetime, we take the crucial first step towards setting it down, allowing the long-buried, authentic self to finally step out of the shadows and breathe. Chapter 6. Breaking the Cycle of Codependency. Of all the survival strategies deployed by the traumatized child, the fawn response is perhaps the most absolute in its demand for self-erasure. While the fight, flight, and freeze responses all involve varying degrees of resisting or escaping the immediate environment, the fawn response requires the individual to actively merge with it. Trauma-based codependency is born in the crucible of a childhood where having personal needs, boundaries, or authentic emotions was treated as an unforgivable offense. To survive the erratic, dangerous, or profoundly needy caregiver, the child learns to preemptively amputate their own sense of self. They become a hypervigilant emotional barometer, constantly scanning the psychological weather of the room. ready to instantly transform into whatever the abuser requires them to be. This is not merely an act of submission. It is a desperate, calculated surrender to prevent total annihilation. The child concludes that if they can become entirely invisible, entirely compliant, and entirely useful, they might finally secure a fragile guarantee of safety. This profound self-abandonment solidifies into a rigid personality structure in adulthood. The codependent individual moves through the world carrying the unconscious belief that their own existence is an imposition on others. They are plagued by a terrifying equation. To assert a boundary or express a genuine desire is to invite inevitable and catastrophic abandonment. Consequently, they become a human shock absorber, tirelessly mediating the dysfunction around them, apologizing for mistakes they did not make, and eagerly absorbing the toxic projections of others. They listen endlessly but never speak of their own pain. They give exhaustively but cannot tolerate receiving. The codependent individual essentially lives a vicarious existence, their internal landscape entirely colonized by the demands, moods, and expectations of the people they are desperately trying to appease. Within this landscape of codependency, several distinct subtypes emerge, each representing a unique fusion of the fawn response with another trauma defense. The fawn-freeze hybrid often occupies the agonizing role of the family scapegoat. Having internalized the abuser's contempt, they willingly absorb the blame for the family's dysfunction, collapsing into a paralyzed state of subservience to maintain the illusion of a peaceful home. The fawn-flight hybrid manifests as the relentless, hyper-competent caretaker. They attempt to outrun their own massive abandonment depression by frantically managing the lives of everyone around them, believing that if they are utterly indispensable, they will never be discarded. Conversely, the fawn-fight hybrid presents a more complex dynamic, often appearing as a smothering, overbearing figure. They use aggressive caretaking and unsolicited advice as a covert mechanism for control, binding others to them through guilt and an artificially manufactured dependency. The path to recovering from trauma-based codependency requires a terrifying confrontation with the fear of self-disclosure. For the codependent, being truly seen is synonymous with being destroyed. Recovery begins with the agonizingly slow process of dragging the authentic self out of hiding. This demands a profound period of grieving. The survivor must weep for the decades lost to the tyranny of approval, mourning the heavy, exhausting years spent maintaining a false self to keep others comfortable. It is a time of righteous anger as the individual finally recognizes the profound injustice of being forced to forfeit their own identity simply to survive their childhood. This grief is the necessary solvent that begins to dissolve the hardened armor of people-pleasing. As the survivor begins to resurrect their dormant identity, they must learn to navigate the terrifying terrain of interpersonal conflict. In the past, any sign of friction was interpreted as a harbinger of abandonment, triggering an immediate collapse into appeasement. True relational recovery, however, requires the understanding that conflict is not the antithesis of intimacy. It is a vital, unavoidable component of any authentic connection. A healthy relationship is not one devoid of disagreement, but one where disagreements are handled with mutual respect and a commitment to collaborative repair. The survivor must learn to systematically dismantle their catastrophic fear of displeasing others. This requires the cultivation of a robust, internal boundary that firmly states, "Disapproval is okay with me." The survivor must practice tolerating the acute discomfort of someone else's disappointment without rushing to fix it, internalize it, or apologize for it. It involves learning to listen to the grievances of others without immediately assuming guilt. When a dispute arises, the recovering codependent must actively resist the overwhelming urge to grovel or merge with the other person's perspective. Instead, they must practice holding their ground, remaining rooted in their own physical body and validating their own right to a differing opinion. The mechanics of lovingly resolving conflict require a complete rewiring of the fawn reflex. It means replacing reactive appeasement with deliberate, measured communication. The survivor learns to utilize I statements, expressing their feelings and needs without aggressively attacking the other party. They learn the vital importance of the time out, the right to momentarily disengage from a heated interaction to regulate their terrified nervous system, ensuring that they do not slip back into blind subservience or panicked retaliation. Most importantly, it involves recognizing that walking away from a toxic, uncompromising situation is not a failure of caretaking, but a profound victory of self-preservation. By steadily practicing these principles of authentic engagement, the codependent individual gradually breaks the chains of trauma-based servitude. They step out of the exhausting role of the universal donor and finally take their rightful place as an equal, sovereign participant in the human experience. Chapter 7. Taming the Storm. Flashback Management. The emotional flashback is the defining agony of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It is an invisible hurricane, a sudden and violent emotional regression that hijacks the adult mind and plunges the survivor back into the terrifying helplessness of childhood. Because these flashbacks rarely feature visual or auditory hallucinations of specific past events, the survivor is often entirely unaware that they are experiencing a memory. Instead, they believe that the crushing despair, the paralyzing terror, or the suffocating shame they feel in the present moment is the absolute truth of their current reality. To navigate the perilous terrain of recovery, one must master the intricate and deeply somatic art of flashback management, learning to weather the storm without being destroyed by it. The storm is almost always preceded by a trigger. Triggers can be external and glaringly obvious, such as a raised voice, a slamming door, or an aggressive posture. However, in the realm of complex trauma, triggers are frequently subtle and insidious. A micro-expression of impatience on a friend's face, a slight shift in tone, or the look of barely concealed contempt can instantly break the survivor's fragile sense of safety. Furthermore, triggers can be entirely internal. A passing thought of loneliness, a moment of physical exhaustion, or even the subtle physiological sensation of hunger can be misinterpreted by the traumatized nervous system as the beginning of an abandonment depression. The mind, hypervigilant and constantly bracing for betrayal, interprets these minor fluctuations as catastrophic threats, throwing the switch that detonates the flashback. When the flashback detonates, it initiates a devastating and predictable cycle of reactivity. The trigger awakens the abandonment depression, an agonizing emotional sinkhole forged in the original trauma of parental neglect or abuse. Immediately, the inner critic springs into action, misinterpreting the pain of the flashback as evidence of the survivor's inherent defectiveness. The critic launches a barrage of endangerment and perfectionism attacks, which exponentially magnifies the survivor's fear and toxic shame. The pain of this combined assault becomes so unbearable that the nervous system is forced to deploy its dominant survival strategy: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The survivor relies on these 4F responses to frantically dissociate from the agony, escaping into rage, obsessive productivity, paralyzing detachment, or desperate appeasement. To halt this devastating cycle, the survivor must learn the vital skill of progressive trigger recognition. The first, and arguably the most difficult step in managing an emotional flashback is simply realizing that you are in one. You must learn to recognize the somatic and psychological signatures of the regression, feeling suddenly small, fragile, and utterly powerless. A hallmark of the flashback is eternity thinking, the overwhelming, despairing conviction that this excruciating pain has always been there and will never end. When you find yourself drowning in this absolute hopelessness, you must forcefully interject a cognitive lifeline. You must declare to yourself, out loud if necessary, that you are experiencing an emotional flashback. By simply naming the phenomenon, you create a crucial wedge of awareness between the experiencing ego and the observing ego, breaking the hypnotic spell of the past. Once the flashback is identified, the immediate task is to establish safety. You must consciously remind your terrified nervous system that you are not in danger in the present moment. If you are feeling overwhelmed in a social situation, you must give yourself permission to retreat to a safe space. In the sanctuary of privacy, you must engage the protective energy of the internal father and the soothing grace of the internal mother. You must speak directly to the terrified inner child, reassuring them that you love them, that you are not going to leave them, and that you will protect them. You must remind the child that you are no longer small and defenseless. You possess the adult resources, the physical size, and the agency to leave any situation or relationship that feels abusive or unsafe. As you soothe the inner child, you must simultaneously manage the tyrannical inner critic. During a flashback, the critic is highly opportunistic, using the surge of fear and shame as leverage to launch its most vicious attacks. You must aggressively thought-stop these narratives of self-hatred. You cannot allow the critic to pile onto the child's suffering. Using the fierce protective anger of a healthy fight response, you must order the critic to retreat, refusing to entertain its catastrophic predictions or its demands for unattainable perfection. You must gently remind yourself that your intense feelings are memories of a traumatizing past, not accurate reflections of your current worth or your future prospects. Managing the abandonment depression also requires a profound somatic awareness. The body must be carefully brought out of its braced, terrified state. This involves deliberate, deep breathing to coax the nervous system out of sympathetic arousal and back into a state of parasympathetic calm. It requires checking the body for areas of intense muscular tension and consciously releasing them. As the physical panic begins to subside, the emotional core of the flashback must be addressed through the necessary process of grieving. The tears that rise during a flashback are often the unshed tears of a neglected child. The anger that surfaces is the unexpressed outrage against those who failed to protect you. By allowing these emotions to flow through you without judgment, you metabolize the toxic energy of the flashback, gradually returning to a state of grounded, present moment awareness. Recovery demands patience with this process. Flashback management is not a rigid formula, but a fluid, intuitive practice. A Swiss Army knife approach where you select the specific tool of self-soothing, boundary setting, or emotional release that is required in the moment. Over time, as you consistently rescue your inner child from the terror of these regressions, the flashbacks will decrease in intensity, duration, and frequency, transforming from catastrophic storms into manageable passing weather. Chapter 8. Silencing the internal enemy. Shrinking the critics. The architecture of the traumatized mind is uniquely characterized by the presence of a relentless, hostile internal entity known as the inner critic. In a healthy developmental environment, a child internalizes the soothing, encouraging voices of their caregivers, constructing a benevolent internal framework that fosters resilience and self-compassion. However, when the environment is saturated with neglect, contempt, or outright danger, the child has no positive reflection to internalize. Instead, the developing psyche absorbs the hostility of the abusers, adopting their dangerous unpredictability and impossible demands as its own internal voice. The inner critic is the ghost of the traumatizing parent living permanently within the survivor's mind. It is a psychological parasite that feeds on the energy of unhealed trauma, ensuring that the punishment of childhood continues long after the original perpetrators have physically departed. This internal tyranny operates primarily through two devastating psychological arsenals: perfectionism and endangerment. Perfectionism, in the context of complex trauma, is not a healthy pursuit of excellence or a noble striving for self-improvement. It is a desperate, terror-driven compulsion. The traumatized child consciously or unconsciously calculates that their abandonment is a direct result of their own inherent flaws. The critic exploits this tragic misunderstanding, constantly whispering that if the survivor could only achieve absolute flawlessness in their appearance, their career, their relationships, and their daily conduct, they might finally earn a basic guarantee of safety and love. This leads to a relentless barrage of internal name-calling, hypercriticism, and the agonizing dissection of every perceived mistake. The perfectionist critic demands an unattainable ideal, guaranteeing that the survivor remains permanently trapped in a state of feeling inadequate and fundamentally defective. Equally destructive is the critic's weapon of endangerment. This manifests as a constant, agonizing anticipation of catastrophe. The critic hijacks the survivor's imagination, forcing them to vividly visualize worst-case scenarios and relentlessly forecasting doom. This involves cognitive distortions such as drasticizing, where a minor inconvenience is immediately escalated into a life-shattering crisis, and catastrophizing, where the future is envisioned strictly as a landscape of inevitable failure and betrayal. The endangerment critic also engages in chronic mind reading, convincing the survivor that others harbor secret, malicious judgments against them. By keeping the nervous system locked in a perpetual state of hyperarousal, the endangerment critic ensures that the survivor never experiences the vulnerability of true relaxation, erroneously believing that constant panic is the only way to avoid being blindsided by the next tragedy. To survive this crushing internal pressure, the traumatized psyche sometimes attempts to export the unbearable weight. This outward projection gives rise to the outer critic. If the inner critic is the internalized abusive parent turned against the self, the outer critic is that exact same hostile energy redirected against the external world. Different trauma types utilize this defense in different ratios. While the fawn type is almost entirely consumed by the self-flagellation of the inner critic, the fight type relies heavily on the outer critic, using indignation, judgment, and contempt to keep the world at bay. The outer critic operates as a hypervigilant sentry, scanning every potential friend, partner, or ally for the slightest imperfection. It is the ultimate enemy of human intimacy. The outer critic destroys the possibility of connection by trapping the survivor in a terrifying no-win situation. Driven by a primal fear of being known and subsequently abandoned, the outer critic actively sabotages relationships before they can deepen. It does this by magnifying the flaws of others, focusing relentlessly on their shortcomings, and manufacturing reasons to feel disgusted or betrayed. When the outer critic dominates, the survivor is constantly engaged in a silent, passive-aggressive trial where everyone they meet is acting as the defendant, and the critic serves as judge, jury, and executioner. This projection allows the survivor to maintain a fragile illusion of superiority and control, effectively scaring others away to ensure that the terrifying vulnerability of genuine intimacy is never achieved. Shrinking these twin tyrants requires a militant, unwavering commitment to cognitive self-defense. The survivor must realize a fundamental, undeniable truth. The critic is not the voice of reality, nor is it the voice of a healthy conscience. It is a pathological echo. The first and most crucial step in dismantling this tyranny is the practice of thought-stopping. When the survivor recognizes the familiar heavy descent into self-hatred or catastrophic forecasting, they must aggressively intervene. Utilizing the fierce, protective energy of a healthy fight response, they must forcefully command the critic to stop. This is not a polite request, it is a deeply internal boundary. By actively saying no to the toxic narrative, the survivor disrupts the hypnotic momentum of the emotional flashback and begins to reclaim sovereignty over their own neural pathways. Beyond merely halting the negative momentum, the survivor must engage in the deliberate practice of thought substitution and thought correction. This involves systematically replacing the critic's toxic lies with objective, compassionate truths. When the perfectionist critic attacks, the survivor must consciously replace the narrative of defectiveness with the reality of their own inherent worth, acknowledging that making mistakes is a fundamental human right, not a punishable offense. When the endangerment critic spirals into catastrophic predictions, the survivor must actively ground themselves in the safety of the present moment, reminding the terrified inner child that they are no longer trapped in the dangerous environment of the past. This cognitive battle must be fought in tandem with emotional release. Simply arguing with the critic is often insufficient, as the critic's power is deeply rooted in unexpressed grief and anger. The survivor must learn to direct their righteous indignation at the critic itself, effectively turning the protective anger outward against the internalized abuser rather than inward against the self. By mourning the agonizing loss of a safe childhood and actively defending the inner child against further psychological assault, the survivor slowly starves the critic of its fuel. Through this relentless, compassionate practice, the deafening roar of the internal enemy is gradually reduced to a manageable whisper, clearing the mental landscape for the quiet, vital emergence of authentic self-acceptance. Chapter 9. The Alchemy of Grief. The 4 Processes of Release. In the landscape of trauma recovery, grieving is the essential engine of transformation. It is the vital biological process that allows the survivor to metabolize the heavy, toxic energy of the past and convert it into the fuel of self-compassion and emotional vitality. For those with complex PTSD, grieving is not a one-time event or a brief period of mourning. It is a lifelong skill, a way of staying emotionally current and preventing the accumulation of new trauma. Because the original family environment strictly prohibited the expression of authentic pain, the survivor was forced to carry their grief internally, where it solidified into a frozen block of depression and shame. To recover, we must learn to thaw this ice, allowing the long-buried emotions to flow through the 4 distinct processes of release: angering, crying, verbal ventilation, and passive feeling. The first of these processes is angering. In a healthy context, anger is the guardian of our boundaries and the protector of our self-esteem. For the survivor, however, anger was likely a dangerous emotion, something that invited swift punishment or terrifying withdrawal from parents. Consequently, the survivor often turns their anger inward, where it fuels the inner critic's self-hatred. Recovery requires reclaiming this righteous indignation. Angering is the process of directing that energy outward, at the original perpetrators and at the internalized inner critic. This is not about seeking revenge in the external world, but about an internal no that rejects the abuser's definition of us. By angering, we diminish the fear and shame that the critic uses to keep us small. We use the fire of our outrage to deconstruct the repetition compulsion, the tragic tendency to recreate our childhood abandonment in our adult lives. Complementing the fire of anger is the water of crying. Crying is the penultimate soothing mechanism of the human body. When we cry, we are not merely being emotional. We are engaging in a physiological process that releases stress hormones and triggers the parasympathetic nervous system's relaxation response. For the survivor, crying for the self is the ultimate act of self-mothering. It is the physical manifestation of self-compassion. Many survivors struggle with dry grief, a state of intense internal pressure where tears feel blocked by the inner critic's judgment that crying is weak or indulgent. We must dismantle these judgments. By allowing ourselves to weep for the lonely, terrified child we once were, we validate our own history and provide the comfort we were once denied. Crying and angering often work in concert. The fire of anger breaks through the walls of the critic, allowing the tears of the child to finally flow. The third process is verbal ventilation. This is the golden path to intimacy and the core of relational healing. Verbal ventilation is the act of speaking or writing about our pain, our memories, and our present moment struggles to a compassionate witness, or even to ourselves in a journal. It is more than just talking. It is the process of thinking and feeling simultaneously. When we ventilate, we bring the fragmented, terrifying memories of the right brain into the logical, narrative structure of the left brain. This integration allows us to make sense of our history and reduces the dissociative fog that often deadens our experience. Through verbal ventilation, we discover that our story is coherent and that our reactions are sane. By sharing our inner world, we bridge the gap of abandonment and begin to experience the profound relief of being truly seen and understood. Finally, there is the process of passive feeling. This is the most subtle and often the most difficult stage of grieving. It involves sitting with the raw, wordless sensations of grief without trying to change them, explain them, or fix them. It is the practice of somatic mindfulness, dropping the attention from the frantic chatter of the mind and into the physical sensations of the body. We may feel a heavy ache in the chest, a knot in the stomach, or a hollow coldness in the limbs. Passive feeling is the act of staying present with these discomforts, allowing them to rise, peak, and eventually pass. This process is particularly powerful for healing digestive problems and other physical ailments that are often the body's way of holding on to unexpressed emotion. By learning to be with our pain rather than running from it through dissociation or addiction, we discover that the emotional abyss is not bottomless. We learn that we can survive our own intensity. Grieving expands our insight and understanding, not just intellectually, but at a visceral level. It is the solvent that dissolves the abandonment depression, that heavy, dark cloud that hangs over the survivor's life. As we master these 4 techniques, we develop a Swiss Army knife approach to our emotional world. We learn which tool to pull out when we are triggered, when to use anger to push back the critic, when to let the tears fall to soothe our fear, when to reach out and speak our truth, and when to simply breathe and feel the weight of our history. Through the alchemy of grief, the leaden shame of the past is slowly, painstakingly transformed into the gold of a life lived with authenticity, depth, and a hard-won sense of peace. Chapter 10. The Relational Cure. Moving from surviving to thriving. The culmination of the recovery journey is the restoration of the individual's capacity for secure, meaningful connection. Because complex PTSD is a wound of the heart and the attachment system, the final stage of thriving is not achieved in isolation, but through the courage to be seen and known by others. This relational cure is a move toward earned secure attachment, where the survivor replaces the early blueprints of betrayal with new experiences of safety, empathy, and mutual respect. To thrive is to move beyond the narrow corridors of survival and into the expansive landscape of a life lived with agency and connection. At the heart of this final phase is the concept of dialogicality, the ability to engage in a balanced, two-way exchange of thoughts and feelings. For the survivor, who likely grew up in a monological environment where only the parent's voice mattered, learning to speak their truth while simultaneously listening to the truth of another is a revolutionary act. Thriving involves meeting healthy narcissistic needs, the right to be heard, the right to be significant, and the right to express one's unique identity. This is supported by a fundamental framework known as the Human Bill of Rights, which serves as a protective shield against the old habits of self-erasure. The Human Bill of Rights reminds the survivor that they have the right to be treated with respect, the right to say no without guilt, the right to make mistakes, and the right to change their mind. It is a declaration of sovereignty. By internalizing these rights, the survivor stops apologizing for their existence and starts asserting their place in the world. This new foundation allows for collaborative rapport repair. In the past, a disagreement felt like the end of the world. Now it is seen as an opportunity to deepen intimacy through honest communication and the shared effort of making things right. A vital tool in maintaining this state of thriving is bibliotherapy, the community of books. For many, the journey began in the pages of a book when a human voice was not yet safe enough to trust. Thriving includes the ongoing practice of seeking wisdom from the great conversation of literature, psychology, and philosophy. Books act as a stable, non-threatening source of reparenting, offering insights and validation that continue to grow the survivor's self-compassion. This intellectual and emotional nourishment ensures that the tools of recovery remain sharp and accessible. As the survivor moves into the world, they are encouraged to cultivate a sense of self-gratitude. This is not a shallow performance of positivity, but a deep, grounded appreciation for the immense work they have done. It is a recognition of the survivor's own resilience, their capacity for change, and the quiet dignity of having reclaimed their life from the wreckage of the past. By practicing regular gratitudes, both for the self and for the safe people who have walked alongside them, the survivor shifts their baseline from a state of deficit and danger to one of abundance and peace. The transition from surviving to thriving is not a destination where triggers and memories completely disappear. Instead, it is a state of being where you are no longer defined by them. You become the compassionate witness to your own experience, the protective parent to your inner child, and the sovereign director of your own future. You have moved from a life of frantic reaction to a life of conscious choice. The landscape of complex PTSD, once a place of permanent exile, has been transformed into a map of profound human depth, empathy, and an unbreakable spirit of survival that has finally found its way home.